And this fight lives on. The promotion and defense of indigenous people's rights, human rights, social justice, and national freedom and democracy endure as challenges and attacks intensify today.
Today's Cordillera is blanketed with more than 100 mining applications covering more than 900,000 hectares of land and more than 100 hydropower and geothermal power projects. Indigenous communities' voices are excluded as their rights to free, prior and informed consent are undermined. And in areas where mining and energy projects exist, heavy militarisation occurs to silence any form of resistance. These violations of ancestral land rights and self-determination mean ethnocide of the ICHRP and the destruction of Cordillera's environment.
As we see a rise in development aggression, rights violations escalate against the Cordillera People's Alliance, the forefront alliance of people's organizations, environmental, indigenous, and human rights defenders in the Cordillera. CPA leaders and members have been listed by state agents as terrorists, insurgents, and armed rebels in malicious cases. Although these charges have been dismissed, government instrumentalities led by the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict continue to tag them as communist terrorist groups and enemies of the state.
Targeting legitimate dissent and actions to uphold ancestral land rights, human rights and environmental protection not only violates people's basic rights and freedoms, but undermines their work and endangers their life and safety. Health worker Rachel Mariano, with 4 other human rights defenders, was jailed for 1 year due to made-up charges by the military. Leader of Ifugao peasant movement, Ricardo Mayumi, was extrajudicially killed in 2017 for opposing the entry of a mini hydro power project. Before his murder, he was subjected to intense harassment, vilification, and illegal surveillance by suspected military elements. Brandon Lee, a US citizen and Ifugao peasant movement volunteer, survived an attempted murder in his home in August 2019 by suspected state agents. He was seriously wounded and went under critical health status for weeks. Before his shooting, he was hounded by threats and harassment, even in social media. We need your help. Support Defend Cordillera PH online campaigns by creating materials to show the world the Cordillera's challenges. Gather friends, families and personalities to learn about Defend Cordillera PH and the Cordillera People's Alliance work. Organise activities and actions to express your solidarity.
Bring Defend Cordillera PH to your government and state representatives, to civic organizations, churches and international bodies. Ask them to push the Philippine government, the big companies and their funders to stop the attacks on Cordillera human rights defenders and to stop all plunderous projects in ancestral lands.
Raise funds for Defend Cordillera PH. Support the legal battle and grassroots work to amplify the defense of the community for their land, life and resources.
The Cordillera people need you. Help us to strengthen global solidarity to defend the Cordillera against plunder and state terror.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Pam Tao Lee, and I am the chairperson of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, US chapter, and I'm honored to be a co-MC for tonight's Stop the Plunder of the Philippines, Defend the Cordillera webinar. In 1972, the regime of Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law in the Philippines, I learned about the violence and the state terror being waged on the Filipino people. And I heard firsthand accounts of the resistance and joined the international movement to end martial law. This was when I became an internationalist as well as an anti-imperialist. 45 years later now, in 2017, I was part of an international interfaith humanitarian delegation to investigate and document the human rights violation mounting under the Duterte regime. I met with families from the Morawe city and victims of Duterte aerial bombings. We traveled into the mountains and we met with the Lumad, land and environmental defenders, and learned firsthand of the extrajudicial killings and other acts of state-sanctioned terror. On the last night of our tour, I asked my host, one of our hosts, Femia, whose husband had just been murdered the week before. We held hands and looked at each other, and I said, Femia, what do you want me to do when I go back to San Francisco? And she looked at me and she said, I hope the American people will continue to find out what's happening in the Philippines, that they will come to understand that it is the American government that controls the economic, the political, and the culture in the Philippines. And I hope that we can be helping each other to stop these systems, because poor people are suffering a very hard life because of this capitalism, this imperialist system here and all over the world. So tonight, because of Femia and of her words, I'm so deeply honored to be a part of tonight's webinar. And now I'd like to introduce Deneen.
Thank you, Pam. Thanks for your inspiring words and your incredible work. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Deneen O'Rourke. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the campaign manager with 350 PDX. 350 PDX is a volunteer-powered grassroots organization in Portland, Oregon, that's helping to build a local and regional movement for climate justice. Our work is entirely based upon the ability of people power to enact change. For the past 7 years, along with our partners throughout the Pacific Northwest, we've been a part of dozens of successful campaigns that have stopped fossil fuel infrastructure projects from being built, and initiatives that have created more affordable and accessible opportunities for renewable energy. All of this is working towards a just transition for climate justice. But all of this work is next to impossible if activism is a crime. With rising fascism and state and police violence in the US, we have a great deal to learn from the brave activists in the Philippines who have been fighting state violence for centuries. Since last spring, 350 PDX has been organizing with the Portland Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines and Anak Bayan PDX, working to educate people in our community about the need to be in active solidarity with land defenders and activists in the Philippines. We know that our struggles are intrinsically connected. As a climate justice activist in the US, I feel it's my duty to oppose the violent authoritarianism of the Duterte regime that's funded by my own government, and to be in solidarity with other environmental activists who face threats against their lives just for being an activist. So thank you so much for joining us today. We have a truly incredible lineup of speakers and ways for you to take action with us to be in solidarity with the Philippines. So let's get started. Next slide, please. We just have a few webinar protocols to make sure everything runs smoothly. If you're a member of the press, if you could add press to your name so we know. To minimize noise, everyone is currently muted. But if you have any questions or you want to cheer on our amazing lineup of speakers at any time, you can use the chat, and there will also be people in the chat to answer any questions that you may have. This webinar is being recorded and it is also being live streamed on Facebook. And once the recording is uploaded, there will also be subtitles. And to join a discussion on social media about this and everything you're learning and raise awareness, please use the hashtags Defend Cordillera and No Anti-Terror Law. And with that, I have the honor of introducing our first speaker, Entang Bautista. Next slide, please, Kat. Entang is the international coordinator of the Kalikasan People's Network for the Environment, the Secretariat of the ILPS Commission on Environment and Climate Justice, and the coordinator of International People's Conference on Mining. Welcome, Entang. Take it away. Oh, Entang, I think you're muted.
Sorry for that. Thank you again, Ninen. Good afternoon. I'm honored and grateful to be invited here in this webinar. It's nice seeing familiar faces, Pam, Brandon, Wendell, Jesse. Um, um, Again, thank you and congratulations to the organizers, to 350 PDX and ICHRP for organizing this. I have my PowerPoint to discuss the situation of environment, land, and human rights defenders in the Philippines. If you can show it now. Okay, the Filipinos and their human rights environmental defenders in our country is in dire situation. Next slide, please. We are in a state of planetary emergency. Philippines is one of the most ecologically devastated and environmentally degraded countries in the world. We are very vulnerable, one of the most vulnerable countries to climate impacts like rising sea level and super typhoons. I think you have heard about the Yolanda tragedy in 2014. If you have been to Metro Manila or major urban centers in the Philippines, you will know how bad our air pollution is, which been affecting not only the environment but the health of the population. Next slide, please. We have lost significant portion of our natural resources like forests and minerals because of corporate plunder, which being consistently promoted and protected by the national government. During the COVID pandemic, we have the longest lockdown, but at the same time, the national government, the Duterte administration, next slide please, continue to enforce the same destructive and plunderous policies and programs. It allows large-scale mining operations, approved and big corporate mining projects, do massive reclamation of our seashores or by foreign corporation, approve large dams, and intensifies the militarization of communities, particularly in the rural areas, in indigenous people's ancestral land, where there is a strong resistance against these environmentally disruptive projects. Next slide, please. During the pandemic, human rights violations continue to rise. As of August 2020, there were 557 environmental defenders victimized by victims of human rights violation. not satisfied with its fascist measure, the Duterte government passed the anti-terrorism law, which actually a law to terrorize the people, to intensify its militarization of the Philippine society. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we remain one of the most dangerous, as I said earlier, one of the deadliest country in the world for environmental defenders. We are the most dangerous country in 2018, and with the new Global Witness report in 2020, we are second next to Colombia as the most dangerous country for environmental defenders, and still the most dangerous country in Asia. At least, next slide, around 300 environmental defenders were killed since 2001. And if you could see, next slide please, it continued to rise, and the most violent and dangerous administration is the current one, the Duterte administration, which accounts more than half of the incidents of killings of environmental defenders. Under his regime, there were at least 157 killed environmental defenders and around 20,000 environmental defenders victims of human rights violations. So if you look at the 2016 to 2019, you know, and this trend still continues up to this year. Next slide, please. So you could also see the average killings. No, I think it's 42. The average killing under the Duterte administration. Previously, it was 12 in the 6-year term of Aquino and 5 annually during the 10-year regime of Arroyo. Next slide, please. So it will just show the distribution of human rights violation, particularly the killing of environmental defenders, and you could see it is concentrated. More dark color means more human rights violation in rural areas, particularly in Mindanao, where there's still so much vast hectares of lands to be plundered or to be controlled by corporate interests or corporations. Next slide, please. More than 90% of these environmental defenders were land defenders. They were the peasants, indigenous peoples, fisher folks, and professionals who were defending lands from the onslaught and plunder of corporate mining, logging, plantations, power corporations. Their services, when we try to estimate or put some economic value, it is worth around, next slide please, 1.03 trillion pesos per year, or around 2.1 billion, around 200 billion a year. The services these environmental defenders be contribution to the nation. Next slide, please. That's the value. So this includes protecting not only landscape but also seascapes, seashores, marine ecosystem, mangrove forests. Okay, next slide. Next slide, please. Could you go back? Sadly, instead of encouraging and protecting them, the government, particularly the state forces, continue to hunt them down. So more than half of the incidents of killing, the suspected perpetrators come from the military, paramilitary, and the police, and some of it from the corporate security. Next slide, please. During the COVID pandemic, they had no respite and having the same abuses: physical assault, threats, trump-up charges, forced evacuation, and killings are the common abuses. If you have heard, our organization, Kalikasan, a national network of environmental groups, is no, and only last June, posters were put on our gates and saying we are recruiters of communist rebels. And last year, we were threatened with the police raid, our headquarters, but we reported this to the Philippine Commission on Human Rights and even went to the UN to raise this vilification and threats to our work and lives. Next slide, please. So the Duterte administration upped its fascist measures, environmental defenders who, of course, engage in environmental advocacy continue to assert their environmental rights in different venues. Locally, if not possible with the national government, we engage the local government units, and also we went at the international arena like the UN to raise our voice and concerns. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of criminalization. Some of our colleagues were arrested last year for protecting Manila Bay because there's a lot of reclamation projects going on, and they were again charged with trump-up cases and illegally arrested and remained in jail up to this day. Next slide, please. So again, the government continue to give economic and even political privileges to corporations for their projects, saying these projects are needed in times of pandemic. And as I said, along with this fascist measure, they continue to pass laws, and as we mentioned earlier, the anti-terror law. But there's a strong opposition from not only from the environmental defenders, but from the people. For example, on the anti-terrorism law, there were already 35 petition or legal case in the Supreme Court questioning the said law. We did not stop. We were not discouraged. The fascists and plunderers want to sow fear among us to stop our advocacy. But you know, the people knows best. They know the truth. That's the human rights, environment, and land defenders in the Philippines continue to multiply. Let me show a video of our recent action. This was produced by 350.org Pilipinas in Asia. And I will end here. Makibaka, wag matakot, long live international solidarity.
Nandito kami ngayon upang isingilin yung 4 na taon na pamumuno ng gobyernong Duterte, kung saan nakita natin yung pagdaos-dos ng kalagayan ng ating kapaligiran at klima.
Kami ay sumasama ngayon sa mobilisasyon ng SONA upang idala sa kalsada ang boses ng higit 20,000 tao mula sa iba't ibang sulok ng mundo na ipatigil na ang terror law.
Tayo ay humarap ng matitinding mga pag-atake sa karapatan ng mga tanggol kalikasan, kung saan unang nakapwesto ang Pilipinas as most dangerous country in the world noong 2019 para sa mga land and environment defenders. Umaabot na ng 157 na mga tanggol kalikasan ang pinapatay sa ilalim ng gobyernong Duterte at halos 20,000 ang iba't ibang mga pag-abuso sa karapatan ng mga tanggol kalikasan.
Makatarungan na ang laban natin at kasama natin ang buong mundo sa laban na ito. Dahil ang laban natin ay iisang pandaigdigang laban para sa iisang tahanan na ang ating mundo.
Ang aming presensya dito ay isang kolektibong paglaban para sa isang mundong mapayapa, sustainable, at may hustisya.
Kahit anong panunupil nila, lalo lang tayo lalakas. Kaya maghanda na sila dahil nangangalampag na ang buong mundo para sa hustisya. Maniningil na tayo sa mga taong nasa poder, sa mga kasalanan nila sa ating kabataan, kalikasan at bayan. We resist as one planet because we have a better world to win.
Kinakailangan ng sustainableng pamamaraan ng pagre-recover ng ating ekonomiya. Kailangan natin ng better normal kung saan yung ating mga industriya ay malinis, kung saan ang ating gawaing pang-ekonomiya ay naka-attune doon sa balanse ng mga ekosistema natin.
Thank you, and Dang. That was just wonderful presentation, and obviously, where there's oppression, there's resistance. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And you know, we will stand with you in really spread the word to stop the crackdown on your organizations and all the environmental defenders there. Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Wendell Bolingnet from the Cordillera People's Alliance. CPA is an independent federation of progressive people's organizations among indigenous communities in the Cordillera region. CPA is committed to the promotion and defense of indigenous people's rights, social justice, national freedom, and democracy, and will address the situation in the region, as well as a campaign that they have launched against Chevron. Wendell?
Thank you, Pam. And good morning from the Philippines. Good evening there. Yeah, good morning from the Philippines. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in this webinar, and good to see you guys, Brandon, and to all the participants of this discussion. Naimbag nga malam tayo amin. Good afternoon or good evening to all of us. The Cordillera region in northern Luzon of the Philippines the situation is no different from the national situation discussed by editing of kalikasan, and also the news that you must have observed or continue to monitor here in the Philippines. I will focus my discussion on the state of imperialist plunder and the state of state terror in the Cordillera. So can you move to the next slide?
I don't think.
Yeah, because I have a PowerPoint just to help facilitate the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
I think it just didn't update, Kat, so if you press view now, it should work.
While they are fixing the presentation, the Cordillera. Oh, you see, it's there. Yeah, the state of plunder and state terror in the Cordillera. It's not. I cannot see it on my screen, so. Okay, so next slide. Yeah, so the Cordillera region is located in northern Philippines with 6 provinces and 2 cities, the city of Baguio and Tabuk in Kalinga Apayao, and the majority of the people here are indigenous peoples. An estimate of 75% of the population are indigenous peoples, collectively called as the Igorots, or literally it means people from the mountains, considering the Cordillera as a mountainous region. Next slide. The Cordillera has a total land area of 1.8 million hectares, and based on the recent census of the Cordillera population 5 years ago in 2015, it says that there are 1.8 million people. On your screen, you see the overlapping projects, extractive, like mining, big mining projects, energy projects, which includes big hydropower projects and geothermal projects. The total land area affected by big mining operations and applications, who are mostly from big foreign countries, covers more than 900,000 hectares. As I said a while ago, the Cordillera land area is 1.8 million hectares. Mining covers more than 900,000 hectares. And as you see on the map, the yellow marks shows the presence and targets for big mining operations in our ancestral land territories. There are more than 100 hydropower dam projects being planned, and in fact somehow started. And one of the big, if not, in fact, the first geothermal plant to be constructed in the Cordillera is from the US. And this is Chevron, which has started its exploration in the province of Kalinga. Next slide. And by the way, yeah, the other, can you please go back to the slide a while ago? The map also shows the deployment of the regular forces of the armed forces of the Philippines. If you notice, where you see the location of big mining and hydropower and geothermal projects, you will see the concentration of the deployment of the armed forces. The slide or the map here did not include also the deployment of the Philippine National Police, the paramilitary forces, but this just shows that where there is big mining, hydropower dam, and geothermal power, such as Chevron, there are human rights violations, with the presence of the military, the police, and the paramilitary. So just looking at this slide, you will ask, where are we and where will the people go? What is behind this economic agenda? What is behind this massive land grabbing and plunder of our ancestral lands and resources? The projects being planned or being constructed does not serve the interests of indigenous peoples, even the non-indigenous peoples of the Cordillera. It is intended for the profit of these foreign big mines of Chevron and other big foreign capitalists. Next slide, please. Yeah, focusing on the Kalinga geothermal project of Chevron. This project covers more than 26,000 hectares. In fact, 26,139 hectares of land affected by the project of Chevron, which owns 60% of this project and 40% for its local partners, the Aragorn Power Corporation and the Guidance Management Corporation. And the exploration, which is ongoing, has a cost of 300 million US dollars. And in the contract of these companies, 60% owned by Chevron, and Chevron will be the one responsible for the overall exploration, operation, and development of the project, because it has the capacity for this kind of project. Next slide. The project started in 2019, last year, despite the continuing opposition of the people, despite the non-issuance of what we call the certification of free, prior, and informed consent, or the approval or acceptance of the people, the government, through the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, has not issued any this so-called FPIC precondition or certification saying that the company, Chevron, and its local partners followed the process, or a certification is stating that the affected communities have accepted the project. In fact, they are operating illegally because the memorandum of agreement that they have signed in 2008 has expired in 2013. And even the so-called certificate of compliance that the NCIP issued in 2008 is no longer valid. But in 2018, the national government under Duterte issued Executive Order 30 saying that there are certain projects, such as the Kalinga geothermal project, and the government issued a certification that the Kalinga geothermal project of Chevron is a project of national significance by the Department of Energy. And by issuing the certification that the energy project as a national significance, the project continued without following the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, particularly the free, prior, and informed consent process, wherein community should first accept or agree to the project. So under this Duterte regime, even the government laws, they try to violate and circumvent by issuing an executive order so as to sideline or to avoid the process and the consultations for indigenous communities should participate, and whether they like it or not, they will accept, they will consent, or they will reject. So this project is operating illegally if we follow the law, even this Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, because the law says before any project will enter and operate in an ancestral territory of indigenous peoples, there should be the free, prior, informed consent or acceptance issued by the NCIP through a certificate of FPIC precondition. So under this regime, even their laws are violated with impunity. Our rights as indigenous peoples are violated with impunity. Next slide, please. Yeah, these are the potential impacts of the project. But just to summarize, a while ago, just the FPIC issue alone, the consultation, the consent has been violated. But the worst is the impact of this project will result in the loss of control or access of the communities, of the community over their land and territories, because it has been grabbed by Chevron and its local partners. And also the deployment of the armed forces of the Philippines at present, the 50th Infantry Battalion and the 503rd Infantry Brigade has been deployed in the area. And the environmental impacts that a geothermal plant will create, and also, as I said a while ago, the violation of our collective rights to free, prior informed consent, all for the interest of Chevron and its local cohorts under the Duterte regime at this time of global COVID-19 pandemic. The government should be attending to the impacts of COVID-19 instead of pursuing, even illegally, this project that will impact and violate our collective rights to our land and resources, and also its long-term effect on the environment. So it does not serve the interest even of the people in Kalinga and the Kula peoples. As you know, the Cordillera is already host to several big hydropower projects. The Ambuklao Dam, the Binga Dam, the San Roque Dam, the Magat Dam, and several hydropower here. And in fact, there is more than enough energy in the Cordillera. So where will they bring this power to be generated, this 100 megawatts to be generated by the Kalinga geothermal project of Chevron? It will serve not the interest of our people. Next slide, please. So on your screen, it just shows the some of the environmental and social impacts of big mining and dam projects. So next slide. The human rights impacts of these projects. On your screen, the left photo is a photo of a forest in Malibcum, Abra, an ancestral domain of the people of Abra in Malibcum. The forest is burning because of the bombs dropped by the 24th Infantry Battalion in 2017, and these bombs burned the forest. So it is not just violating our human rights, it's also destroying these military operations are destroying the forest and the environment. The right photo shows a house in Busao Mountain Province forcibly occupied by the 81st Infantry Battalion, which is there to protect the entry of a big mining application, an application for financial and technical assistance agreement covering more than 40,000 hectares of the Cordillera Exploration and the Nickel Asia Corporation in partnership with the Japanese company Sumitomo Mining Company. Next slide. As Enting discussed a while ago, indigenous peoples and environmental and human rights defenders continue to be persecuted, in fact, criminalized, and killed. The photo here shows, the slide shows the leaders of the Cordillera People's Alliance who were included in the 2018 terrorist proscription, or the petition filed by the Department of Justice identifying more than 600 people and including leaders of the Cordillera People's Alliance as terrorists. In fact, while they say that our names were delisted in this listing, it did not delist or stop the AFP in pursuing these people. In fact, that remains to be a hit list or a military hit list. And the security and lives of people enumerated there continues to be in danger. And like in our case, the regional commander of the Cordillera, the Philippine National Police in the Cordillera, at the height of this pandemic, when Manila and Luzon is under lockdown, he issued a shoot-to-kill order directed against so-called communist organizers in the region, and that in fact targets activists like us, that when we organize in response to the COVID-19 or we launch any activity, they are directing snipers to kill us. Of course, we condemn this, and the police has to withdraw or correct his order. But until now, the same police officer, the Cordillera PNP chief, has threatened us also to file cases in court for illegal trafficking of minors because they accuse us of being supporters or recruiters of the New People's Army. What I want to emphasize here is that after the frustrated extrajudicial killing of Brandon, who is one of our panelists, the 54th Infantry Battalion, who attempted his murder in Ifugao, continues to terrorize the people of Mountain Province, imposing forced surrender and all forms of various attacks, not only in social media against the Cordillera People's Alliance, but our local leaders, including the families, including our families, and in my case, they have targeted my entire family, including sustained harassment and intimidation against my youngest son, who is just a minor. The implementation of EO 70 to end the so-called local communist armed conflict is not targeting armed combatants involved in the armed conflict, but they are targeting civilians and activists like us and it's intensified with the enactment of the so-called anti-terror law. So the Cordillera and its people are under attack, so we have to defend it. And we owe it to the legacy of our forefathers, martyrs, and heroes to continue the struggle they have started. And we are not bowing down. We will not be silent. We will not be silenced. We continue the struggle, but we need your support. The broad national, international solidarity support to defend the Cordillera. So in this webinar, we are calling everyone to support and participate in this campaign to defend the Cordillera, to defend us for our life and resources, to defend the environment and our human rights. And we are calling everyone to please participate and support the Global Pact or Solidarity Pact in defense of the Cordillera and its people. Thank you very much. And if there are questions, we are willing to try to respond because of the limitation of time. Thank you, and good evening to everyone.
Thank you so much, Wendell, and thank you for your incredible work in the Cordillera People's Alliance. We really appreciated hearing directly from you and learning so much about your work. And we're going to hear more about the Global Pact that Wendell just mentioned at the end as well. So next, we have the next slide, Kat. Next, I'm excited to introduce my colleague at 350 PDX, Indy Keith. Indy has been organizing for civil rights, environmental justice, and climate action since she was a teenager. Now, as the coalition manager for 350 PDX, she connects and collaborates with partners and coalitions in Portland and across the state to drive justice-based solutions to the climate crisis and the systems of oppression that created it. Take it away, Indy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Deneen. My name is Indy, and I'm here with 350 PDX. And first off, I just want to thank everyone for having me. It is an incredible privilege to share a virtual stage with these incredibly brave and powerful activists and organizers. I'm so grateful to be here. And I'm here to talk a little bit about why 350 PDX is on this panel in the first place, and why it is absolutely essential for US activists to understand the role of global solidarity in sustaining justice work in 2020 and beyond. So, we work in climate action and climate justice, and worldwide Indigenous and local communities are managing forests that sequester an amount of carbon equivalent to about 33 times our current annual emissions, and this is likely an underestimate. At the same time, research is showing that Indigenous managed lands have lower rates of deforestation and better conservation outcomes than protected land that excludes Indigenous people. And probably not much of that is a surprise to the folks on this call. But it's important to keep in mind, if we're trying to stop the climate crisis, we can't just stop at keeping fossil fuels in the ground. We have to be just as invested in keeping land in Indigenous hands and in returning that which has already been stolen. What's more, the same industries that climate activists and land defenders are fighting across the globe, mining, logging, dirty energy, and agribusiness, if we cut off profits inside of our borders, but we fail to stop these industries from simply shifting their operations to our neighbors in the Philippines and other places, we are shooting our chances at stopping the climate crisis in the foot. I think it's also really critical as a bigger picture that those of us in the United States see Duterte's activities in the Philippines as part of a global resurgence of fascist and authoritarian activity that we in the US and here in Portland, where I am, are very much a part of. We've already heard from Intang and Wendell about the repression and violence they've faced from the state and from extractive corporations and paramilitaries for their work as land defenders. Activists and organizations are red tagged, accused of being communist sympathizers, targeted for brutality and assassination in order to suppress this movement for justice and sovereignty. But criminalizing activists as terrorists and labeling defenders as anti-development is part of a broader global strategy used by governments and the media to delegitimize local communities' concerns. Duterte's anti-terror bill makes this struggle even more dangerous. Close to home for us here in Southern Oregon, 350 PDX has been part of the years-long battle to halt the Jordan Cove project, which is an export terminal and pipeline for fracked gas slated for construction in Coos Bay. Pembina Pipeline Corporation, who's the owner of the Jordan Cove project, was revealed this year to be the sole funder of an entire unit of the Coos County Sheriff's Office, dedicated to handling what they call security concerns related to Jordan Cove, despite there being no physical structure present at the site. This unit bought riot control equipment, monitored the activities of Jordan Cove opponents, that's us, and worked with private security companies that also worked for Pembina to gather intelligence on local residents, tribal members, and other environmental activists. If built, this project would transport 438 billion cubic feet of fracked gas per year, and dozens of property owners could see their land seized via eminent domain. Like we've seen in the Philippines, law enforcement has been openly deputized to protect corporate interests at the expense of the people they're supposedly sworn to serve. This is personal for Portland too. Our city is well past 100 nights of consistent protest for racial justice and against police brutality, though many protesters here are this week redirecting energy to relief efforts for our climate-caused wildfires. While our local district attorney has declined to prosecute many arrested activists, this morning the US Attorney General encouraged his federal prosecutors to bring charges against our protesters for sedition, conspiracy to overthrow the US government. The threat of federal sedition charges and terrorist designation is currently hanging over the heads of Black Lives Matter and anti-fascist protesters in the streets of Portland and other US cities. However, if it proceeds successfully, you can be sure that it will be weaponized against land defenders, Indigenous people, and others inconvenient to the progression of extractive industries. We've actually already seen this happen already in moments like the resistance at Standing Rock, where Indigenous activists like Red Fawn Fallis, who was recently released from prison after, I believe, 57 months in jail, were targeted for harsh federal sentences first and worst. We're seeing that authoritarians and corporations from the Philippines to the United States are studying one another's playbooks. They're collaborating around the world right now. What we're seeing here at home in the US is the groundwork being laid for repression on the level of the Duterte regime and beyond. Not only do we here at 350 PDX and in this city have an obligation as climate activists to stand with Cordillera, our safety and our survival in this fight depends on our ability to learn from this movement. By winning, by resisting repression, by standing in solidarity and refusing to be isolated or silenced, we are helping to keep each other safe. When fascism, colonialism, and extractive capitalism gain ground anywhere, they get stronger everywhere. There's more profits, there's more resources, there's more legitimacy, and more normalization of practices that ought to be tremendously abnormal. Land defenders in the Philippines, pipeline opponents in Southern Oregon, Black Lives Matter, and anti-fascist activists here in the streets of Portland all understand this to be true. To win justice and liberation, we have to confront these forces everywhere that they rear their ugly heads. So the bad news is that everywhere is a lot of places, and the work for our movements is rarely going to let up. But the good news is that we have the world's best comrades in this fight, and together we're only getting stronger. So to everyone on this call, from me and from 350 PDX and from Portland, we thank you for your bravery and your solidarity.
Thank you so much, Indy, for helping us better understand the connection with the fascism and environmental injustice and the struggle to protect the land from the Philippines to the US and Portland in particular too. Thank you for giving us that update as well. Now I would like to introduce on the next slide here, my dear and wonderful, powerful, inspirational big sister, Rhonda Romero from Bayan, USA. Oh, is that right? Okay. Rhonda is with Bayan, USA. It's an alliance of Filipino organizations in the US representing students, scholars, women, workers, artists, and youth, and serves as a center for educating, organizing, and mobilizing anti-imperialist and progressive Filipinos in the US. I'd like to now turn it over to Rhonda. Hi. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for including me in this really powerful webinar. The Cordilleras has been a special place for me for over 20 years now. And I have to say that the Cordilleras was really instrumental even in the building of Bayan USA. I hope, by now on this webinar, it's become pretty clear how important the struggle of the Cordilleras is to the struggle for climate justice, the struggle for self-determination of Indigenous people, and the struggle against the forces of capitalist greed, militarization, and empire worldwide. As I mentioned, the struggle in the Cordilleras was a really important place for the building of the Filipino movement in the US even, and in the development of our alliance, Bayan USA. We saw, 20 years ago that the Cordilleras was really a place where people in the US could go to immerse themselves in kind of like a ground zero for the fundamental problems of the Philippines and for understanding them. Both the land and the people in the Cordilleras, as Entang and Wendell both described, are resource rich. It's a place where elite Filipino families and multinational corporations own and control thousands of hectares of land for the production of export crops. It's a place where mountaintops have been blown apart and miles of land have been excavated by multinational corporations for the gold and other minerals beneath the ground, where half of the landmass today is under application by multinational mining corporations. It's a place where communities have existed since time immemorial, but are being shoved aside literally, and their sacred land and rivers are rerouted to make way for World Bank funded dams, for multinational hydroelectric power projects in order to provide water for big cities far away, or for multinational projects that have no benefit to the people who have actually lived there for generations. But it's also a place for the ground zero of the resistance, where Indigenous people have hundreds of years of history of fighting off colonial invaders from Spain to the US. They've fought in the cultural sphere, keeping their language, celebrations, customs, music, and culture alive, despite colonial efforts to erase these. They've fought in the legal sphere, asserting their rights within the framework of international and national laws to have control over their ancestral domain. And they've fought in the physical sphere, putting their bodies on the line in demonstrations, and sometimes even taking up arms over the generations to defend their ancestral land from invaders, like the Spanish and American armies of the past, to today's Philippine military, who are occupying land, conducting aerial bombing of communities, and big land grabs of multinationals and large Filipino landowners who have private armies in order to terrorize the people and force people off the land. So I can honestly say that in going to the Cordilleras and arranging these solidarity trips to the Cordilleras from the year 2000 to the present, we've brought dozens or probably hundreds of people by now to the Cordilleras to really immerse and witness the convergence of these two things, the forces of greed and capital versus the people who are defending the land and their ways of life. In bringing people there, we've seen the transformation of people who were observers or people who just study the situation to people who have then committed their lives to the fight in the struggle for the Filipino people, in defending their land, in self-determination for the people of the Cordilleras, and by extension for the fight of all the Filipino people for their self-determination and for their democracy. Bayan USA, we started out as just a few organizations, and now we're over 30 across the country. We continue to bring people to the Philippines to learn and immerse in the situation. But the most important part of that has actually been what they do when they come back. And that is something that we're hoping, through this webinar, we're giving you a little taste of. You can't go with us to the Philippines at this very second, but we hope that through the presentations today, the testimonies today, you'll get a little taste of both the immense repression that the people of the Cordilleras are facing, and what's at stake for them, and then the tremendous amount of courage they have in standing up for the land, and standing up for their way of life, and standing up for the Filipino people as a whole, and the need for us as people in the United States to take up the campaign Defend Cordillera, and to implement it here from abroad in order to support that Filipino people's struggle in the Cordilleras. So thank you for having me on, and I want to actually segue to our next speaker, who will talk a little bit more about her own exposure trip to the Philippines and what it has meant for her. Thank you.
Well, let me introduce Win Moon. She's a student activist based in San Francisco and organized against privatization of education. And I've been right there on the front lines with her on that. Solidarity for migrants and anti-war campaigns. She went to the Philippines in 2018 with the League of Revolutionary Students as part of an expo trip with Anak Bayan USA. She's developing solidarity to the Philippines, so Puso City College of San Francisco, and is strengthening anti-war efforts through Resist US-led War. So, Wenmu, let me turn it over to you.
Yay, thanks, Pam. So yes, in the summer of 2018, I went on a life-changing exposure trip as a member of League of Filipino Students that time. It was a 10-day international solidarity mission to the Cordilleras, Philippines, where integrated along with other youth and students, activists, with Indigenous peoples, ICHRP, and human rights defenders. And our integration involved so much. We learned the history of resistance of the peoples in the Cordilleras, the discrimination ICHRP faced in the Philippines from education, health, environment, and their fight for self-determination and against land grabs and military aggression. We learned the specific ways ICHRP's democratic rights were undermined and how fiercely they fought for their land, for their rivers, the Chico River, and the fight against hydroelectric projects contributing to the resource extraction and mining. And we learned how that fight was vital to their survival. And we also learned that the armed forces of the Philippines showed no mercy in enacting terror on them and protecting the interests of multinational corporations. Our integration involved listening to the problems and documenting the human rights violations of a community, a barangay, and how, for example, the AFP knocked on homes with fake warrants as part of a as their method of manipulation and to terrorize the community. And so we had engaged in a workshop to help the community identify what is a fake warrant. We did that with the Cordillera People Alliance. We did it with human rights defenders, and we heard about the encroachment on the land because of its minerals, its plants, and its abundance. And we witnessed a barangay council leader, and different community leaders speak to the community and unite their peoples through discussions and democratic ways to move forward amidst the onslaught of attacks. We participated in a community discussion post-procession of a death of a member of their community who was a former paralegal before Brandon Lee was, his name was Ricardo Mayumi, and we engaged in cultural sharings that deepened our solidarity. And the lessons that we learned all together were really everlasting and tremendous. We learned about the several development projects that are specifically funded by various banks. One that also is linked with the International Monetary Fund, Chinese banks and domestic Philippines one. We learned the Armed Forces of the Philippines with the PNP use weapons funded by US tax dollars to terrorize the land defenders, surveil organizers and community leaders, putting up flyers and wanted signs with the reward in their mass leaders' detainment, and also using rape on Indigenous women as a tool of war. We learned the Philippines government under Duterte and previous regimes before has been utterly neglecting the Cordillera peoples. No roads, miles away from hospitals, not a nearby school in sight, and the secondary education dropout rate is so high that literacy is a major challenge, to which the MNCs take advantage of literacy to obtain their land via forms to sign. These are only a few examples of how the AFP, along with certain corrupt officials, collaborate to strip Igorots and peasants of their land. And yet, the peoples in the Cordilleras are not fooled, and nor are they wavering to this day. And I highly encourage peoples, when they can, whether you're a youth or student, an activist, a parent, a scientist, a journalist, I absolutely encourage everyone to go to the Cordilleras when they can, when it's possible, because when you are living and learning day to day in the conditions of the Cordilleras, you'll realize the goals and the aspirations of all people to have a sustainable planet, to have the freedom and dignity to live amongst your community is the same. And so for me as a Burmese youth, and understanding the challenges of ethnic unity and land encroachment and military aggression, the ways of resistance in the Cordilleras have uplifted my spirits 100-fold. And so one of the ways is youth and students, and peoples organizing in the Cordilleras, despite the harsh conditions to travel, they managed to meet, strategize, mobilize, and the symbol, the rice terraces that have been shown throughout this webinar, they're magnificent, they're a sight, but it embodies a deeper meaning where it embodies the tremendous capacity and the absolute yearning to be able to harvest what was sowed for themselves and not for the oppressors, and part of the long-standing culture and traditions that are beautiful. So let's strengthen the international solidarity between land and climate defenders in the US and the Philippines. Let's stop the plunder in the Philippines. Let's commit to international solidarity, and let's defend the Cordilleras.
Ooh. Amazing, Win Moon. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to go back. Kat, if you don't mind going back a slide. We have a really exciting video or audio recording that we're going to play for you, recorded just for us to hear this evening, from Tom B.K. Goldtooth. And for many years, under Tom's leadership, the Indigenous Environmental Network has supported the Cordillera struggle, not just in words, but also in deeds. EIN is a network of Indigenous grassroots activists based in the United States that is celebrating its 30-year anniversary this year. IEN uplifts the voices of the front lines on an international level, bringing them to events such as the United Nations climate change conferences. Tom Goldtooth is a citizen of the Diné Nation and has since been adopted by the Dakota Nation, and has led the Indigenous Environmental Network since 1996. You can go ahead and play that.
The Indigenous Environmental Network stands in solidarity with the land defenders and environmental defenders of the Cordillera. We are proud to have stood side by side internationally with the Cordillera People's Alliance over the years to protect Mother Earth from plunder by mining, forests, and policies that put unwanted development projects over the human rights and needs of the people. We fully support the recommendations as put forth in the report of the United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights on the situation of human rights in the Philippines. To be specific, we join the international community in demanding that the Indigenous Peoples' Right Act be fully implemented, that the principles of free, prior, and informed consent is applied so that Indigenous communities have genuine and meaningful participation at all stages of development projects and the right to say no. And the Indigenous children have universal access to quality education that is in line with their cultural identity, language, and values. We, along with the international indigenous community, call for an end to the killings. We agree that activism is not terrorism. On the other hand, since COVID-19, the anti-terror bill, Duterte's shoot to kill orders, harassment of activists and their families, and the denial of food, economic aid, and health care for our Cordillera relatives are acts of aggression and terror being committed by the Duterte government. To this end, we join with your other allies in the United States to bring the Philippine Human Rights Act before Congress. We call for the end of U.S. funds for military assistance, for police and military, including military equipment there in the Philippines, until such time as human rights conditions are met. Thank you. Mitakie Owasi.
So much appreciation for Tom for drawing attention to the shared demands of the indigenous people from Turtle Island across Mother Earth and to the Philippines. We thank you, Indigenous Environmental Network. So now we would like to move on to our next speaker. On August 6, 2019, an assassination attempt was made on the life of Brandon Lee. Brandon was red tagged and targeted by the Philippine government in an effort to silence him and his advocacy on behalf of the environment, on behalf of peasants and the indigenous during the 9 years that he lived in the Cordillera region. So let's next now hear from our wonderful brother, Brandon Lee.
Hi, thank you, Pam. Thank you, Deneen. Thank you to all the organizers of this webinar, Portland Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines, ICHRP US, 350 PDX, Kalakasan, and CPA, whom I work very closely with being part of the provincial chapter of Ifugao. I first got involved with international solidarity during the US-Iraq and US-Afghanistan War, when my professor, the late Helen Toribio, opened our eyes as young college students that we should have community exposures and integrations. My background being an anti-war activist left me wanting more. It wasn't until I joined LFS that I learned about the imperialist wars of aggression and plunder. It was with LFS that I learned about the International League of People's Struggle, organizations around the world linking arms to fight imperialism, fascism, sexism, racism, homophobia, and xenophobia. It was with this global consciousness that armed me with the powerful concept of international solidarity that I was able to battle the identity politics that holds many of us back from joining an organization that accepted me as one of their own, a kasama. It wasn't until 2010 that I made the decision to join full-time the organization in the province of Ifugao, working with the Ifugao Peasant Leaders Peasant Forum, the forerunner of the Ifugao Peasant Movement. There was a period of less than 2 years that I moved to Baguio City so our daughter Jessie can be with her mother who was in school there. When the military gunned down the human rights officer, Wayang Bugatti, we as a family decided it was best that I go back to help in Ifugao. This was a dark time in Ifugao as my colleagues and I were targeted by the fascist military through surveillance, red tagging on social media, and eventual assassination of Ricardo Mayumi, an indigenous peasant leader, leading the opposition against the Ayala-funded mini hydro dams. For defending the Ifugao land, life, and resources, supporting the indigenous people of Ifugao in their campaign to protect the Alimit and Ibalao River. I was targeted by the 54th Infantry Battalion with an attempted assassination last year on August 6th. More so than ever, the fascist state is targeting the unarmed organized resistance to the greedy state policies with build, 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 with kill, kill, kill. The Philippine state seems desperate to cut off international support that they killed the Italian missionary, Father Pops, for helping build Luma Indigenous schools, and the Dutch NGO worker, William Gertman in Aurora, for supporting literacy programs that taught rights to Aita Indigenous people. More recently, they took away the visa of Sister Pat of Australia and the Professor of International Law of Human Rights, Jill Boehringer, for the human rights work they did. But they can't silence the growing Filipino dissent and the growing international criticisms. For that, after knowing the Filipino situation, we have an international duty to help the Filipino people. I'm happy to inform you that the Philippine Human Rights Act, PHRA, will be introduced this week by U.S. House Representative Susan Wild. This bill will cut off military aid to the Philippines until human rights is upheld and there's full accountability to rights violations. In the words of Father Pops, your dreams are my dreams. Your struggles are my struggles. Long live international solidarity. Defend Cordillera. Fight Lata.
Thank you, Brandon. You inspire people across the world for all of us to be like Brandon. Yeah. So the next slide, please. So there was a lot of mention, I think almost every speaker spoke to and actions that we can take. And the next few slides will be talking about how we can step up and really make international solidarity a real thing. And one of them is to have your organizations sign on to the Global Pact, promote the Global Pact, and let's take a look in terms of, it's been summarized already, but to be able to, in the Indigenous tradition of community solidarity, signify our unity and commitment through this pact. There's one, to strengthen and broaden international solidarity and support for the Cordillera people struggle. Number two is to participate in activities, campaigns, advocacy, and other areas of mass struggle that will empower, spread awareness, encourage active participation, and garner support for the Cordillera Indigenous peoples' issues and concerns. And three, so important here, to condemn all attacks against the land and lives of the Indigenous peoples in the Cordillera and demand accountability from the state, its agents, and private corporations responsible for such offenses. This is the Global Pact that everybody has spoken to, that we must really unite around. The next slide, please. So here are, in addition to the Global Pact, you will be getting this information. There'll be follow-up, so don't worry if you're not able to download all of these 3 sites right now. You will be getting a follow-up. But number one, to sign on to the Global Pact, there is an actually sign-on link, and we will be sending that to everybody, but that is here now, number one. Number two is support the Human Rights Act. It'll be going, being introduced, as Brandon has already said, tomorrow. And we really want to let our Congress people, political elected representatives know where we stand on this. So it is really important, if you can use social media and whatever, get this link out there and send messages in support of the Human Rights Act. We really want it to be discussed in committee, and we want it to get out of committee. So that is our goal, okay, in the mobilizing. And finally, we want to ask, in terms of this work that needs to be done, is that we would like to be able to have funds to be able to continue to give voice to these issues. And one of the things it says is being able to fund it. So we have a site here in which you can make contributions, donations, to be able to uplift voices like Brandon and others here in the US, to be able to go out there and spread the word and continue the advocacy and the organizing. So that is, I don't think that there is another slide. Am I correct in that? Deneen is going to close us out. And is she there?
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. And thank you to all of our incredible speakers. Even though we won't be able to hear you, let's give them all a round of applause. And if you're a panelist, you can unmute yourself and give a round of applause.
Woo!
Yay!
Yay! Yay!
Woo! Thank you, everyone. Please stay tuned for all the ways that you can take action with us to be in solidarity with the Philippines.
Maraming salamat.
Are we going to have a group picture, Deneen?
We don't have all the attendees on video, so we can't really. Well, we could do it with the panelists.
Yay!
All of our panelists, do you want to
Thank you.
turn your I'm gonna stop the live stream.
Good night, everybody. And
Good
for
night.
you in
Thank
the
you again.
Philippines,
Bye.
have a good afternoon.
Yeah.